Siona God, hello all. Oshta, afternoon, good afternoon, and Wado, thank you for watching. So this is day 8, part C of reading Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. And so the sentence that I just read goes along with this example. And so I'm going to reread it. It says, hostility to middleman minorities has been widespread for centuries, though many have managed to live peacefully until some dramatic event or some talented demagogue managed to stir the population against them. For example, the plagues that decimated Europe in the Middle Ages were sometimes blamed on Jews, leading to mob violence against them. Oh, wow. Where has hostility to middleman minorities been greatest? There may not be any single predictor that covers all cases, yet in broad terms it seems clear, painfully clear, that they have been most hated where they have been most essential. This has not always been the same as where they make their greatest economic or other contribution. Jews have made great contributions to the United States in a wide range of fields, but there are many other Americans who have also made great contributions in those same fields. Even if Jews' greatest contributions to the world have been in the United States, there have been other countries in Eastern Europe, for example, where they were more essential because they were relatively few. There were relatively few other people doing what they did. The persecution and violence have driven many middleman minorities from many countries, and some have been explicitly expelled by government authorities. The widespread belief that such groups have made no quote-unquote productive, end quote, contribution to the economies in which they lived has often been belied, B-E-L-I-E-D, by the decline or collapse of those economies after their departure. Geez Louise. Yet, even after such collapses, popular hostility has seldom abated. 20 years after the expulsion of 50,000 Indians and Pakistanis from Uganda in the 1970s had wreaked havoc on that country's economy, economic desperation led the government to seek their return. Oh, wow. But the Uganda-Africa Trade Movement issued a statement declaring that its members, in quotes, intend to wage an atrocious war everywhere in Uganda on any Asian returnee, end quote. Whoa. More explicitly, they said, we intend to harm, maim, cause them a lot of suffering, even killing them in the most despicable way ever if they don't leave our land and country immediately. That's kind of crazy, right? You order them out and you tank your own economy, and then somebody is like, well, they can come back to help the economy out, and then other people are like, nah, we'll kill them. You know, you'd rather live in a bum economy than have people in there that can help boost it. Make that make sense. And then you want to complain about being in a bum economy. I don't know. What was threatened in Uganda has been carried out against middleman minorities in many places and times. For example, the Turkish persecutions and mass slaughters of the Armenians during the First World War included, in quotes, bayoneting the men to death, raping the women, dashing their children against the rocks. Whoa, end quote. When the American ambassador protested to a Turkish official, the reply he received was, in quotes, the massacres, exclamation point. What of them, exclamation point. They merely amuse me, exclamation point. What? End quote. On one death march in which thousands perished, end quotes, Ambassador Morgenthau, Morgenthau, reported that many of the women had been stripped stark naked by their guards and by brigands, Brigands, in the league with them. The poor creatures could hardly walk for shame. They staggered into the city bent double, end quote. Oh my God, these calculatingly sadistic tortures and humiliations were a foretaste of what would happen to the Jews in Nazi extermination camps a generation later. Note that merely killing middlemen minorities was not considered sufficient. Gratuitous infliction of both physical and psychic pain has marked violence against the Chinese in Southeast Asia, as well as against the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire and the Jews in Europe. This suggests that what their enemies feel is not simply a need to be rid of them, but also a need to rid themselves of feelings of inferiority by subjecting middleman minorities to humiliation and dehumanization. It's crazy. These middlemen, in quotes, their wealth inexplicable, their superiority intolerable. end quote, are basically an ego problem among those who have been so blatantly outperformed. Oh, well, yeah. This is also consistent with the history of the countries where middlemen minorities have been either accepted or bitterly opposed. It is in precisely those times and places where there are few others who can supply the skills of middleman minorities that they are most hated. Whether it is the Koreans in today's American black ghettos, Jews in eastern Poland in centuries past, Chinese in Southeast Asia, Armenians in regions of the Ottoman Empire where they were the predominant entrepreneurial group, Lebanese in West Africa, Ibos in northern Nigeria, Indians in East Africa, or others in other places where middleman minorities have been more accepted, have been places where others have had similar skills and entrepreneurial occupations, such as the United States, Australia, Britain, and the Scandinavian countries. It has been precisely where middlemen minorities have been most needed economically that they have been most hated, while places that have been not nearly as dependent on them have been places where they have found their greatest acceptance. This does not present a very reassuring picture of human reasonableness, but neither does the history of most middleman minorities. Where members of middleman minorities have largely moved beyond their middleman occupations into other businesses and professions, and where they have also been accepted by a larger society, the quote-unquote clannishness, end quote, of their either struggling times has tended to erode away as they became assimilated members of the larger society. This happened more often, for example, among Jews in Anglo-American societies, including Australia, than among those in Eastern Europe. Notable examples of 19th century Western Europe included Benjamin Disraeli, Disraeli, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx. While religious Western Europe restrictions kept Jews out of the British Parliament during the first half of the 19th century, individuals known of Jewish ancestry were able to enter if they were Christians in religion. Thus, David Ricardo sat in Parliament in 1819 and Benjamin Disraeli entered in 1837, eventually becoming Prime Minister. Although Karl Marx was descended from a long line of rabbis on both sides of his family, he was baptized and raised as a Christian, living among other Christians in Germany. He never considered himself a Jew and always spoke of Jews in the third person. Like as in the Karl Marx, like that bad dude, right? I mean, even religious Jews were so acculturated in pre-Hitler Germany that they referred to themselves as, end quotes, Germans of the Mosaic faith, end quote. Even after emigrating overseas, they often settled among German immigrants in other countries and participated in German cultural organizations in those countries, but Polish Jews never considered themselves Poles, either in Poland or overseas, and did not settle in Polish immigrant neighborhoods. Much the same story could be told of the overseas Chinese, who continue to live in their own enclaves in countries where they encounter hostility, but in the United States no longer live primarily in Chinatowns, which have been left to a minority of later arriving immigrants or others who have not assimilated. It would be good to know that proportion of it would be good to know what proportion of groups known as middleman minorities actually worked in middleman occupations at a given time, but data are seldom available. Most Jews have been middleman minorities in some times and places, but not in others. Apparently, most Lebanese immigrants to Argentina were in such occupations, but most Argentinians in the Ottoman Empire were not. Among the occupations declared by Middle Eastern arrivals in Argentina from 1876 to 1900, the overwhelming majority were merchants, and more than a quarter were specifically peddlers as late as 1910. However, it is known that more Armenians in the Ottoman Empire were peasants than were entrepreneurs or monkey lenders. But it was in the latter roles that they were more likely to come to the attention of members of the larger society, either through personal contact in the marketplace or through general notoriety. To a greater or lesser degree, that has been true of other middleman minorities. Moreover, the general attitudes of the surrounding society that were formed during the era when these various groups were prominent as middleman minorities have long outlasted that era and continued on as a majority in the later generations of middleman minorities have gone into other businesses and professions. Moreover, the striking success of these later generations in education and other occupations continues to fuel envy and resentment. The role of middleman minorities in various countries around the world has attracted the attention of many scholars and produced many suggested explanations of their roles and experiences. One of the most often cited studies has been, in quotes, A Theory of Middleman Minorities, end quote, by Edna Bonacich. That name sounds familiar. Bonacich. A crucial element in her theory is that of sojourning. Middleman minorities have often been sojourners rather than permanent settlers in the societies in which they live because, in quotes, they begin as sojourners, end quote. According to Professor Bonacich, they have less reason to assimilate to the society around them, while sojourning, in quotes, is not a sufficient condition of the middleman, end quote. Professor Bonacich says, in quotes, it is a necessary one, end quote. However, if the economic function performed by middlemen requires social separation from the surrounding society and its culture, then whether they plan to return somewhere else or not is no longer crucial. And that's something else that I grew up hearing a lot is, why are we going to let them, quote unquote, right, them in? And it means all different nationalities from all different countries and all that kind of stuff, all walks of life. If they're just going to not only send their money back home, like I talked about on another video, but they're going to get their education here, like we're going to pay for that, taxpayer dollars, whatever, and then they're going to go back and be doctors and lawyers and all that kind of stuff in their own country and stuff. So why do that? I think once you get your degree and stuff that we've helped pay for, you are supposed to stay here for a certain amount of time to then give back to the community that you reside in, and then you can head out, you know. I think that would be better. The sojourning theory encounters serious problems that the economic explanation does not. One of the most prominent of the middleman minorities has been American Jews who, as a professor Bonacich concedes, end quote, had no plan to return to Eastern Europe, end quote. American Jews, in fact, had far lower rates of return migration than did other contemporary immigrants to the United States or Mexican immigrants in later era. Even less could Jews who settled in Australia or South America be likely to have had plans to return to their countries of origin. Edna Bonacich attempts to salvage her sojourner thesis by saying that although American Jews did not see Eastern Europe as a place to which they would return, they retained, in quotes, an unusual attachment to an ancestral homeland, end quote, in the Middle East. Yet Zionism was by no means common among Jews around the world during the period of mass migration to the United States. And in fact, there was hostility to the idea among Orthodox Jews, as well as among Western European Jews in general. Moreover, emotional attachment to an ancestral homeland such says nothing about any plans to return to it today. Yeah. I mean, in the current climate, haven't you noticed? Like, people will shun you or like whatever it is if you even like think to ask a question or think to talk about or discuss whatever it is. But like, now come on, if it means that much to you, like, why are you living here? Why not go and like help build up your country, like where your people originated from? And I don't know what country that is. I'm not saying it's Israel, because clearly there are all sorts of Jews all throughout the world, right? So wherever your family originates from, or whatever your heart calls you to, why aren't you living there? That's all I'm asking. And I'm not trying to be rude. I'm not saying you should get out. I'm just saying, if it's everything that you say it is, how come you're here though? Like, but why here? I don't know. Irish American Jews, like Jewish Americans, have maintained an emotional attachment to their ancestral homeland, but nevertheless, there are more people of Irish ancestry living in the United States than in Ireland. Just as there are more Jews living in the United States than in Israel. It's just like what I was saying, is it not? By the time Zionism was rekindled after the Second World War by the establishment of Israel, Listen, by the time Zionism was rekindled after the Second World War by the establishment of Israel, American Jews were culturally assimilated and had rising rates of intermarriage with the general population, as well as moving out of middleman occupations and into the professions. In short, sojourning seems neither necessary nor sufficient, nor even plausible, to explain the cultural separation of Jews or other middleman minorities. While it is true that many middleman minorities began their careers of, I was just thinking, God, how many times can they write middleman minorities? It's just like, it's a tongue twister for me. Began their careers abroad as sojourners. The Chinese in Southeast Asia or the Lebanese in West Africa, for example. So did other immigrant groups, such as the Italians, an absolute majority of whom returned to Italy not only from other European countries, but also from the United States and even South America. That remains true today of immigrants from India and Pakistan working in the Middle East. As Professor Bonicic concedes, the fact that many middleman minorities began as sojourners does not mean that most of them in fact returned home. There were growing permanent settlements of Chinese in Southeast Asia, for example, even as the Chinese continued to live wholly separate social lives from those of the surrounding Malay or Indonesian societies. Sojourning has been a phase in the immigration of many groups who never became middleman minorities, with their settlements abroad becoming permanent only after achieving a satisfactory modus vivendi, or vivendi, vivendi, with the surrounding population. Another feature of middleman minorities cited by various scholars has been their tendency to invest in highly mobile capital, exactly, intellectual skills being the ultimate in portability, rather than in fixtures that cannot move, such as the machinery of heavy industry, land, dams, or transmission lines for electricity or conduits for water. No doubt centuries of a history of being victims of spoliation, spoliation, and confiscation, as well as being forced by mob violence or official expulsion to flee and leave much of their wealth behind, has made highly portable wealth particularly attractive to middleman minorities. Cash, gems, and intellectual skills are among these highly portable forms of wealth. Moreover, even forms of wealth that are not strictly portable but which can be readily liquidated, such as inventories of groceries, textiles, clothing, or sewing machines, have been preferable to steel mills, railroads, or hydroelectric dams. None of this depends upon a quote unquote orientation toward a homeland, end quote. As Professor Bonicic contends, Indians and Pakistanis fleeing Uganda fled to Britain more often than to India or Pakistan. And in an earlier era, Jews fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe fled to the United States far more often than to the Middle East. While our focus has been on patterns among middleman minorities in general, what of the Jews specifically? To what extent are they generic, and to what extent do they have their own separate and distinct patterns? Jews are like every other individual and group, unique in some ways and very much like other people in other ways. Whatever has been unique or thought to be unique about them has been seized upon and used negatively by their enemies. Their supposed role in the crucifixion of Jesus, end quote, Christ killers, end quote, in the bitter indictment of a bygone era of religious bigotry, can hardly have been the reason for that bigotry. Exactly. For it was the Romans who actually crucified Jesus, and not such guilt has been attached to the whole Italian people of later centuries. Yeah. Moreover, wholly fictitious complaints have been invoked against the Jews, that they were responsible for medieval plagues, for example, when whoever made up these charges obviously had other reasons for hostility. It is these other reasons that have been common to numerous other groups who have faced similar hostility in countries around the world, despite differing from the Jews in religion, language, and other social and cultural traits. Some have regarded the Holocaust as making anti-Jewish feeling unique, at least in intensity. Yet what made the Holocaust possible were technological and organizational capabilities for mass murder that enemies of other middlemen and minorities simply did not have available. In view of what was actually done to some of these groups, this is little reason to doubt that their persecutors would have used such a technological and organizational capabilities if they had had them. Oh, you're darn right they would have used them. Don't they go, hey, you mean to get Love you, mean it.